He shoved the black man onto the courthouse steps, no warning, no questions. Just a badge, a frown, and cold handcuffs. The man didn't resist, didn't speak, just stared, like he'd seen this coming. What that young cop didn't know, the man he just arrested decides the fate of the nation. If that made you pause, don't scroll, because what happens next rewrites what you thought justice looked like. Tap, like if you believe dignity doesn't need volume, and come with me. This story begins with silence but ends with power. The morning air was thick, not with rain, but with that heavy silence cities get when something's about to shift. A line of people waited quietly outside the Supreme Court. Some murmured into their phones, others scrolled, and then they noticed him. A tall black man, older sharp-boned coat buttoned to the neck, stood near the top step. He didn't pace, didn't check the time. He just stood there, still, like the building behind him belonged to him in some quiet ancient way. People glanced unsure. Was he staff a protester? A visitor? That's when the young white cop saw him, eyes narrow, shoulders squared. He didn't ask where the man was going, didn't ask if he needed help. He just walked up, hand on his belt. ID now. The man turned slowly, voice steady as if correcting a student. It's in the car, just stepped out to think. No raised tone, no sudden move. But that didn't matter. Without hesitation, the officer grabbed him, spun him around, and pushed him down on the steps. Cuffs clicked. Someone gasped. A phone clicked on. But the crowd remained silent. The man didn't flinch, didn't plead, didn't even ask why. He just looked forward at nothing. Or maybe at everything. The booking room was quiet, not peaceful quiet, but the kind that hums under bad lighting and worse intentions. They didn't ask him anything. Just led him to a metal bench, slapped down a clipboard, and mumbled to no one in particular. No ID, call him John Doe. Behind a low desk, a clerk, young, uninterested, typed like every keystroke was a burden. He didn't look up once. Didn't ask the man's age, didn't ask if he understood the charges. He just filled in blanks with assumptions. Race black, age 60-something, maybe. Occupation unknown. When they reached for the fingerprint scanner, it blinked red. System error. Again, forget it. Log it manually. Across the room, two younger officers leaned into each other. One whispered, "He doesn't act like a regular guy. You see his eyes." But no one said anything to him, and he still said nothing back. Yet beneath the silence, something else was happening. He took in the nameplate on the desk, M. Harrisoff Center, one screw missing. Noted the badge number on the sergeant's chest slightly tilted from the weight of the radio mic. Up in the corner, the only surveillance camera was half blocked by a puffy winter coat carelessly tossed over the mount. Not an accident, he registered that too. Movements in and out of the room, he watched them. Who avoided eye contact? Who gave it too much? Every gesture, every glance, every careless corner. He absorbed it all, not to defend himself, but to understand the room, to understand them. He wasn't lost, he wasn't confused, and he wasn't afraid. No, he was studying, like a man who had seen rooms like this before, too many times, and knew this one would matter. The local courthouse sat like it always did, tired, underfunded, pretending to carry the weight of justice, while its ceiling fans buzzed like they were running out of patience. They brought him in just after lunch. The chains around his wrists clinked softly with each step, a sound that somehow felt louder than it should have been. People in the hallway turned their heads, not out of concern, out of habit. He walked slowly, not because he was old, but like someone who had no interest in proving he could move fast. The bailiff barely looked at him. The public defender glanced once and went back to her phone. To them, he was another case file in handcuffs, another man without a name. Inside the courtroom, the chatter settled. He sat alone at the defense table, silent hands folded gently, almost too gently for someone in cuffs. From the back row, a woman in her 60s leaned over to the man beside her. She squinted, then whispered, "He looks like Langston Pierce. You know, from the news." The man beside her shrugged, didn't even bother to look. But the woman kept watching. There was something about the way he held himself, not proud, not stubborn, just still, as if the chaos around him didn't reach him. His wrist showed faint bruises where the cuffs had bitten in. He rotated one slowly, massaging the bone beneath, not like it hurt, but like he was reminding himself he was still here. The judge hadn't entered yet, but the courtroom had already made up its mind. Some looked at him like he was a nuisance. Others like he didn't belong there. A few just ignored him altogether. But in the corner near the clerk's desk, a younger court officer paused. He held a stack of papers but wasn't reading them. He was watching the man. His brows drew together slowly like a memory trying to surface. And the man, still not speaking, tilted his head slightly. Not enough to be noticed by most. Just enough to let the young officer know, I see you seeing me. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't a challenge. It was acknowledgement. And in that moment, something shifted, not in the room, but in the people watching. They couldn't quite name it, but something about the silence began to feel different. Like it wasn't just the silence of a man with no voice, but the silence of a man waiting for the world to realize what it had just done. The courtroom door creaked open, and in came the Judge White, late 50s robes, wrinkled from sitting too long or caring too little. Judge Grayson didn't look up right away. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat like the air itself owed him silence, and opened the file without urgency. Then flatly he read, Case number 681, defendant charged with disturbing the peace, public nuisance. He paused like he expected no one to care. And no one did. The courtroom was half empty. The people who were there weren't watching for justice. They were just watching. At the prosecution table, a clean-cut woman in a dark blazer stood up. Her voice didn't carry warmth, only certainty. Your Honor, this man refused to cooperate or identify himself. There's no reason to drag this out. I suggest a short sentence, time served, maybe 30 days. She didn't even glance at the man she was trying to punish. He wasn't a person to her, just a line on her schedule. On the defense side, a court-appointed attorney finally turned to acknowledge the man beside her. She looked at him like he was already lost. Sir, do you even understand the charges? No kindness, no patience, just the obligation of a question she didn't want answered. He didn't reply. He didn't move, didn't even shift in his seat. From the back of the room near the gallery, one of the arresting officers leaned against the wall, arms crossed, smirking. He whispered, not too quietly, "Shouldn't take more than 5 minutes." The judge heard it, didn't say a word. He turned to the defendant, pen already in hand, ready to jot down whatever was needed to close the file. "Mr. Doe," he said, almost annoyed, "do you have anything to say for yourself before I move on?" And for the first time, the man looked up. He didn't speak, just raised his eyes, calm, unwavering, and stared directly at Judge Grayson. No words, no plea, just that stare. The kind of stare that made time forget to move. The kind that didn't challenge with barrier, but revealed the imbalance in the room, revealed who had power and who had none. Even the clerk paused her typing. The young court officer in the corner sat up straighter, and the judge, for a flicker of a moment, cleared his throat again. Not because he needed to, but because he didn't know what else to do. The silence wasn't empty now, it was full, heavy. It filled every corner of that room with the weight of a question no one dared ask. Who is this man? There was a pause, a long one, after the silence in the room swallowed the judge's question. The man said nothing, still, composed, watching. Judge Grayson shifted slightly in his seat. Maybe it was the stare. Maybe it was the stillness. Or maybe it was something he couldn't name. He exhaled sharply through his nose, flipped a page, and spoke like the case bored him now. 30 days, county jail, contempt of court. The gavel didn't even come down hard, just a tap, almost lazy, like the punishment meant nothing because the man meant nothing. But then something happened. A change so small if you blinked you'd miss it. The man's lips curved, not fully, not wide, just enough. A smile. Not mockery, not sarcasm, more like someone who'd been waiting for this exact moment and finally saw the system expose itself. The kind of smile that doesn't warm a room, it chills it. The smirk on the arresting officer's face faded. He straightened up, arms uncrossing. Something in him, that part trained to sense when control shifts began to stir. He couldn't name it, but he didn't like it. At the clerk's station, a young woman stared at her screen, blinking more than usual. She wasn't typing anymore. She was rechecking something. She leaned forward, pulled up the intake file, then the arrest log, and finally the emergency database, fingers trembling just slightly. The image on the screen, it was the same man, same coat, same face. But the name, her eyes widened. She whispered, not to anyone in particular, more like trying to convince herself she hadn't read it wrong. Langston Pierce. No, can't be. She glanced up slowly, eyes locked on the man sitting silently at the table. He didn't move, but she knew. The name wasn't just familiar, it was monumental. And now the weight of that name hung in the air like a storm cloud no one saw coming, except him. He remained still, hands relaxed cuffs, still digging lightly into his skin. But the power in the room had shifted imperceptibly but undeniably. Grayson didn't notice. Not yet. He was already on to the next case file trying to keep the docket moving. But others did. The young court officer from earlier, the one who couldn't stop watching, now leaned in, elbows on knees, his whole body tense. The defense attorney, still flipping papers, slowed her movements without realizing it. Even the prosecutor hesitated, sensing something off, though she wouldn't dare say so out loud. And the man, he just sat there, that same quiet smile resting on his face. Not triumphant, not arrogant, just assured, like he'd seen it all before and knew exactly what came next. The courtroom hadn't exploded. No one yelled, no gasps or camera flashes, not yet. But it felt like everyone had taken one collective breath and forgot to let it out. In a quiet back office just beyond the courtroom, a phone rang. It wasn't the desk phone, not the main line. This one was direct, the kind only a few people ever called. The clerk looked at it once, frowned, then picked up. Clerk's office, downtown district court. The voice on the other end was calm, precise, not rushed, but with a tone that left no room for small talk. You're holding someone you absolutely shouldn't. Langston H. Pierce, Supreme Court Justice. The clerk blinked, sat up straighter. He glanced at the screen again as if hoping he'd misheard the name. I'm sorry, could you repeat? There's no time to repeat. You need to alert the presiding judge immediately. That man cannot be held. Not for one more minute. The call ended, just like that. No room for questions, no room for doubt. He looked down at the file in front of him, the one marked John Doe. Intake photo, age estimate, no ID. But the face, it was him. He stood up quickly, nearly knocking over his chair, and moved toward the courtroom. But just outside the door, he hesitated. Inside, the hearing was still in motion. Judge Grayson was speaking. The prosecutor was flipping through notes. The man at the center of it all sat perfectly still, that same half smile unmoved. The clerk leaned in toward a bailiff by the door. I need to get a message to the judge, now. The bailiff frowned. Is it urgent? Yes, it's federal, about the defendant. That word federal got his attention. They passed a note forward. It moved from hand to hand through the gallery, over to the side desk, finally landing at the foot of the bench. Judge Grayson took it, without looking, opened it, and scanned the contents. Then with a low chuckle, he set it aside. We'll sort that out after the hearing, he said, barely hiding the smirk. Probably just some bureaucratic overreaction. He didn't glance at the man in cuffs, didn't ask a single question, just moved to the next line on his docket like nothing had happened. In the gallery, someone shifted uncomfortably. The court reporter glanced up, uncertain. Even the prosecutor paused, then quickly looked back down. But the judge unaffected. In the back of the courtroom, a young officer who'd been watching closely this whole time leaned toward his supervisor. Sir, I think there's been a mistake. That man. But before he could finish, the supervisor cut him off with a look. Cold, sharp. Don't interfere, he muttered under his breath. This one's ours. The younger officer leaned back, lips pressed tight. His hands fidgeted in his lap. He didn't look away, but he didn't speak again either. Something had shifted in the air. Not a full wind, just a tension, like the room itself knew a line had been crossed but didn't know how to say it out loud. And in the middle of it all, still sitting there quietly, was the man himself. Unbothered, unshaken, just waiting as people around him began to realize what they'd done. Judge Grayson raised his pen, slow, deliberate. He wasn't in a rush, not because the moment required care, but because in his mind this was routine. Another name, another file, another man forgotten by the system. The ink touched the paper just barely when, bang, the double doors of the courtroom slammed open with a force that echoed off the marble walls. Gasps shot through the room, papers fluttered, every head turned. 3 people entered. Dark suits, steady steps, no hesitation. They didn't ask permission. They didn't flash badges right away. They didn't need to. The one in front, tall, crisp voice, no emotion, stepped forward, pulled a document from inside his jacket and announced, "All rise." There was a beat 1 second where no one moved. Just silence. Frozen. Then the man's voice cut through again, sharper this time. Presenting Supreme Court Justice Langston H. Pierce. Like a switch had been flipped, the entire room stood too fast, too suddenly. Chairs scraped, shoes shuffled, hearts skipped. The judge's pen dropped from his hand and rolled off the bench, landing on the floor with a hollow clack. The prosecutor dropped her file. The public defender turned pale. The bailiff's mouth opened slightly, then shut. The court clerk, young woman who had searched the database earlier, brought a hand to her mouth, covering a soundless "oh my God." At the back of the gallery, the elderly woman who'd whispered his name an hour ago, her eyes welled up. She didn't speak, just let one tear fall down her cheek. And in the middle of it all, still seated, was him. Langston H. Pierce, calm, composed. He didn't move right away, didn't look at the judge, didn't look at the officers now lining the wall in silence. He just stood, slowly, like a man who'd been waiting not for permission but for the truth to arrive. As he rose, the cuffs still hung at his wrists, but no one dared step forward to remove them. Not yet. He looked around once, not to accuse, not to gloat, but to let the weight of the moment land exactly where it needed to. Then finally his eyes found Judge Grayson. The judge tried to speak, opened his mouth, but the words didn't come. His face had lost color. His hands were now hidden beneath the bench. Langston said nothing, because he didn't have to. The room had already heard everything they needed to. For a long moment, no one moved. Langston H. Pierce stood at the center of the courtroom, wrists still bound by the cuffs they had so casually placed on him hours before. And yet, in that moment, he was the only man in the room who wasn't restrained by anything. No shame, no fear, no need to explain. He reached up slowly with calm fingers and unbuttoned the top of his long coat. The fabric rustled soft, deliberate, as he slipped it off his shoulders and folded it over one arm. There was no hurry, no need for drama. From the inside pocket, he pulled out a small black case, leather-bound, worn at the corners. He held it up with quiet precision and opened it. Inside was the seal, gold, heavy, recognized in every courtroom across the nation. Supreme Court of the United States. People leaned forward instinctively, like seeing it made everything real. Langston looked out over the room, not scanning, not searching, just letting the silence settle the way dust does after an explosion. Then finally he spoke. His voice wasn't loud, it didn't need to be. I chose silence, not because I had nothing to say, but because justice isn't just what we say, it's what we allow. Each word landed like a bell toll, steady, clean, impossible to ignore. And today he said, turning slightly toward the judge, the officers, the lawyers, I let you show the world exactly who you are. He didn't raise his voice, didn't point, didn't accuse. He just stood there steady and let the weight of truth fill the room. The prosecutor shifted uncomfortably in her seat. The public defender looked down at her hands. The judge, Judge Grayson, sat back, breath shallow, eyes fixed on the floor. And then with no fanfare, no guards to escort him, no words of permission, Langston turned and walked. The bailiff instinctively moved to stop him, then froze halfway. No one said a word. No one dared. He passed by the gallery, the same rows that once held whispers and smirks. Now they held silence and shame. One of the officers who had arrested him earlier stood near the door. His eyes flicked toward Langston, but then dropped just as quickly. He took a step back, gave way. Others followed. Some moved aside. Some just stared at their shoes. Not because they were told to, but because they couldn't bear to meet the eyes of the man they had dragged in chains. Langston never looked back, never raised a hand, never asked for anything. He walked through the doors like he belonged to something larger than the building itself. Like the law wasn't a title, but something he wore in how he carried himself. And in that quiet wake, he left behind no speeches, no verdicts, no vengeance. Only one thing remained: dignity. Pure, unshakable. Not bought, not borrowed, not declared by force, just present. And for the first time that day, the courtroom didn't feel like a place of punishment. It felt like a place that had just been reminded of what justice actually looks like. It didn't take long. By the time Langston Pierce stepped beyond the courthouse doors, the story had already escaped those walls. One video, grainy, shaken but undeniable, had made its way online. The image of a black man in cuffs, the quiet courtroom, the moment 3 agents had walked in and turned history on its head. People didn't scroll past it. They watched. They paused. And then they shared it. By late afternoon, his name was on every screen. Justice Langston H. Pierce, detained, silenced, dignified. Headlines flooded in, not cautiously, but with an edge sharpened by national shame. Supreme Court Justice detained without ID. Is being black a crime now? Silenced in court until the nation stood up. Cable news hosts struggled to keep their tones steady. Some didn't try. You could hear it, the shake in their voices as they read out the charges that had been filed just hours before. Disturbing the peace. Contempt of court. Contempt. The word itself began to echo, not in defense of the system, but in indictment of it. Crowds started to gather, not chanting, not shouting, but standing in stillness. Hundreds at first, then thousands. Many held signs that bore no slogans, only a name. Langston Pierce. Across social media, hashtags began to surge. But they weren't angry. They were sobering, measured, almost mournful. He said nothing. Justice does not need our dignity, walked out. At the White House, a press conference was called, but it wasn't the press secretary who appeared, it was the president himself. He stood at the podium, his face drawn not with politics, but something closer to personal reckoning. Langston Pierce, he said, is not just a jurist. He is a symbol of what this country aspires to be. Today we failed him, we failed justice, and we failed ourselves. He didn't shout, he didn't spin. I have spoken to Justice Pierce personally. I offered not just an apology, but a promise. There will be a full investigation. No delay, no interference. And this time people believed it, because the system had finally been caught in the light. Judge Grayson was suspended within 24 hours. The arresting officers removed from duty. Internal Affairs opened an inquiry so wide it swept through every hallway of that courthouse. But perhaps the voice that moved people most came from someone no one had known before. A young woman, early 20s, soft-spoken. Camille Tran, Jr., court clerk. She sat across from a news anchor, her hands folded tightly, her voice a notch above a whisper. I saw him that morning, she said, and I knew who he was. I just didn't know if I was allowed to say it out loud. She paused, eyes watering not from guilt, but from something deeper, recognition. Everyone around him acted like he didn't matter. But he looked like someone who remembered exactly who he was. I kept thinking, if I stay quiet, then I'm part of it too. The clip went viral, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest. It was followed by another image just hours later, a photo of Langston mid-step leaving the courthouse. No entourage, no statement, only a folded coat over his arm and a stillness in his eyes that felt more powerful than any gavel ever dropped. The caption read, "He never raised his voice." But somehow the whole country heard him. After the cameras left, after the headlines began to cool, and after the courthouse slowly returned to its usual rhythm of creaking doors and stamped papers, someone noticed. It was the janitor, actually. Quiet man, worked nights, always careful, always the last to leave. He was wiping down the witness stand when he saw it, a single sheet of paper folded neatly and left behind on the wooden rail. There was no envelope, no name, just ink, and a hand that had taken its time. He didn't open it at first. He looked around, waited. Then with the reverence of someone touching something sacred, he unfolded it. 3 short lines written in calm, deliberate strokes. To all who watch me fall silent, thank you for showing me who you are and for reminding me why justice must never sleep. There was no signature. It didn't need one. Word of the letter spread fast, but it wasn't published in full. Some things people seemed to agree weren't meant for clicks. Instead, they whispered it, passed it along like a truth too fragile to shout. And it stayed not on bulletin boards, but in the quiet corners of memory where moments that matter tend to settle. Outside the courthouse, life moved on. Cases resumed, files reopened. People pretended things had gone back to normal. But for those who had been there that day, really nothing quite looked the same, especially not for the young ones. That afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to lower behind the courthouse steps, a school bus stopped a block away. Kids spilled out backpacks, swinging sneakers, tapping pavement. Among them was a boy, maybe 11, buttoned-up shirt, tie a little crooked, and eyes that held more questions than most adults could handle. He stood by the gate holding the strap of his bag, watching the building like it had just told him a story only he could hear. And then he saw him. Langston. No press, no escort. Just the man coat over one arm walking alone toward the street. Their eyes met. And the boy, without thinking, without words, raised his hand. Not a wave, not a salute, just a gesture. A simple, small acknowledgement from one quiet soul to another. Langston slowed, and for the briefest moment he stopped. He looked at the boy, really looked, and in his eyes there was no anger, no burden, only that same stillness, the kind that doesn't break under pressure, it becomes deeper. He gave a small nod, a smile that barely moved his lips, but said everything. And then he walked on, not into history, not into legend, just forward. Sometimes justice doesn't shout. It just waits, watches. And when it finally speaks, the world listens. If this story moved you, tap, like, share it, and subscribe to Mr. Max Stories, where every quiet soul finally finds a voice. Your support fuels our mission to tell the stories that matter, the ones that echo long after they end.